Welcome to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews. After our chapter yesterday, reading of the judgment of God on Babylon, today in Isaiah chapter 48, we hear God speaking to his own people once again. Hear this, O house of Jacob, who are called by the name of Israel, and who came from the waters of Judah, who swear by the name of Yahweh, and confess the God of Israel, but not in truth or right. For they call themselves after the holy city, and stay themselves on the God of Israel. Yahweh of hosts is his name. The former things I declared of old, they went out from my mouth, and I announced them. And suddenly I did them, and they came to pass. Because I know that you are obstinate, and your neck is an iron sinew, and your forehead brass. I declared them to you from of old, because before they came to pass, I announced them to you, lest you should say, My idol did them, my carved image and my metal image commanded them. You have heard. Now see all this, and will you not declare it? From this time forth I announce to you new things, hidden things that you have not known. They are created now, not long ago. Before today you have never heard of them, lest you should say, Behold, I knew them. You have never heard, you have never known. From of old your ear has not been opened. For I knew that you would surely deal treacherously, and that before birth you were called a rebel. For my name's sake I defer my anger. For the sake of my praise I restrain it for you, that I may not cut you off. Behold, I have refined you, but not as silver. I have tried you in the furnace of affliction. For my own sake I do it. For how should my name be profaned? My glory I will not give to another. Listen to me, O Jacob, and Israel, whom I called. I am he, I am the first, and I am the last. My hand laid the foundation of the earth, and my right hand spread out the heavens. When I call to them, they stand forth together. Assemble, all of you, and listen. Who among them has declared these things? Yahweh loves him. He shall perform his purpose on Babylon, and his arm shall be against the Chaldeans. I, even I, have spoken and called him. I have brought him, and he will prosper in his way. Draw near to me, hear this. From the beginning I have not spoken in secret. From the time it came to be, I have been there. And now the Lord Yahweh has sent me, and his Spirit. Thus says Yahweh, your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. I am Yahweh your God, who teaches you to profit, who leads you in the way you should go. Oh, that you had paid attention to my commandments. Then your peace would have been like a river, and your righteousness like the waves of the sea. Your offspring would have been like the sand, and your descendants like its grains. Their name would never be cut off or destroyed from before me. Go out from Babylon, flee from Chaldea. Declare this with a shout of joy, proclaim it. Send it out to the end of the earth. Say, Yahweh has redeemed his servant Jacob. And they did not thirst when he led them through the deserts. He made water flow for them from the rock. He splits the rock, and the water gushed out. There is no peace, says Yahweh, for the wicked. I have not actually counted, but if somebody wants to go back and count how many times, it's twice in this text, but it starts with, Hear this, O house of Jacob. Then in verse 12, Listen to me, O Jacob. How many times in this book have we seen that phrasing? How often is the Lord crying out to his people that they would listen, that they would hear him, that they would trust in him? Again, I didn't count, but if you want to count and let me know, I'll include it in a future study. It's been frequent, a number of times. Called by the name of Israel, Yisrael in Hebrew, the name God gave to Jacob after their wrestling match in the book of Genesis. Yisrael, El is the Hebrew word for God. So you've got a verb there meaning something like to wrestle with, to strive with. So you've got someone who has wrestled with God is the meaning of that name, but they are God's people. that they came from the waters of Judah. This is the promised land crossing. As Joshua leads the people into the promised land, and God parts the waters of the Jordan River for them that they may cross over on dry ground. Now, interesting note here with verse 1. This all fits Jesus. This is who Jesus came to be for us. Jesus, the Messiah, born of the house of Jacob, who is Israel reduced to one. He did everything Israel should have done, as we're going to read over in verse 17, 18, that they should have kept his commandments. Well, Jesus did. He did all of that for us. He came from the waters of the Judah, as you start to think about his baptism in the Jordan River. So, lots of connections here that we can certainly be making. However, verse 1 ultimately refers to the Israelites not doing this. So they swear by God's name. They confess his name, but not in truth. They speak it with their lips, but they don't believe it. Jesus will say this of the Pharisees. Now, what might this look like today is a question we can discuss in our families. Lots of examples could be had. You could talk about the person who comes to church, sits in the pew, but they don't actually believe. This was more common in America's past when it was popular or even culturally expected that you were part of a church. Today it's not. Today it's not popular to be Christian. It's not expected to be Christian. It's not expected that you would go to church. So that part might be gone, but that doesn't mean there aren't still a few holdovers, a few people that go to church just because it's the thing to do on Sunday. If we don't trust, if we don't actually believe in Jesus, that's a different thing. So that's one example. You could probably come up with others together in your conversation. Verse 3, God has declared things and then he has done them. We know this. We've talked about it. It's been your family's conversation in the last couple of days. But here's a review again. Verse 4, the negative conversation here around God's own people. So, obstinate, not a compliment. Their neck is an iron sinew. So, this is an image that is not uncommon in Scripture to actually see. Usually, this is a little bit more clearly referred to, I guess I'd say oxen, your animals, your beasts of burden that you use to work your fields. It's also usually used as the idea of being stiff-necked. So the reference here is to an animal who's plowing your field, and you are in control of your animal's plowing. And so you turn your animal, you guide them in the way that they need to walk, you guide them in the way they need to work. If they are stiff-necked, it means they won't turn their head, and if they won't turn their head, then their body won't follow. So they're going to end up going where they want to go rather than when you want them to go. That's the reference here as well. Your neck is an iron sinew. We're not turning. We're not returning to the Lord. We're not trusting in him. That's the point here. Forehead of brass. I don't know, but I wonder if it's the origin of our phrase today. Why can't you get it through your thick skull? Nothing penetrating. They just won't get it. They won't hear God's command. I declared to you from of old, so salvation, redemption that God has promised and that he has given to them, so that lest you should say my idol did them. So God has given prophetic works to his creation. He has given prophets. He has given his spoken word in order that we cannot take the credit or falsely attribute the credit to someone else. God has done this. It is God who saves his people. Verse 6, now God is going to be announcing to them new things. As we think of the new things, we end up thinking of the new covenant. We think of the body and blood of Christ. We think of the Lord's Supper. We think of the paradise that he is creating for us. All of these things would be unknown to them, but good to think about nonetheless. new things. God is going to redeem them by the use of a man named Cyrus. Chapters 44 and 45 again, God calls this man by his name to be the deliverer, the one who will rescue Judah from Babylon. Verse 8 gives us a really powerful picture of original sin. From before birth, you were called a rebel. Our culture often ends up thinking that you're not alive if you're in the womb. And they talk about that in any number of ways. But the point here being, you cannot be a sinner if you're not alive. Here, God is saying we were rebels before we even came out of the birth canal. We were still in our mother's wombs, and we were already sinful. This is our conversation around original sin, that we have been conceived even as sinners. I think of Psalm 51:5 for that from David. Verse 9, for my name's sake, for the sake of my praise, for my own sake, for my own sake, my glory. Let's see a little repetition here. God spared Israel, not because of them, not because they deserved it, but so that his name would not be would not be shamed among the nations, but instead would be revered among the nations. This sounds very similar to Exodus chapter 32, verse 11 and 12, where God is preparing to destroy Israel on account of their sin, and Moses convinces him not to. Moses appeals to the Lord and says, why should the Egyptians see this wrath of yours and think that you just brought these people out here to destroy them? It's a paraphrase, but Moses is there making use of the idea of what God was planning. God had delivered Israel, not just for Israel's sake, but so that the world would know that he alone is Lord and that he would care for his creation. And so to destroy Israel would really make the other nations not think highly of the Lord. And that's what we're seeing here as well. God has done this. God has spared Israel for the sake of the nations, so that others would see and believe. Verse 10, a little different here. God has refined his people, not as silver. We think of refining process, and typically it's metals that we're talking about, and Scripture does that as well. We have this word shows up a few times. Instead, God has tried them in the furnace of affliction. So silver you refine with fire. God has refined Israel with suffering. This is actually very well connected to us today. God refines the church today through suffering. God refines you today through suffering. We live in a culture, we talked about this a day or two ago, a hedonistic culture where it's all about pleasure and we try and avoid pain and suffering. We view pain and suffering as being evil and bad for us. The scriptures don't speak that way. In fact, quite the opposite. The scriptures teach that we will suffer. And it's through suffering that we build endurance and perseverance and character and hope, because it's in our suffering that we're pointed to Jesus and what he has done for us. That's like the theme of Peter's epistle to the church, which he wrote to the Christians who were suffering at the hands of Roman persecution. All right, so verse 12 we've already talked about. God again calling to his people that they would listen to him. But he also adds on, and we've seen this a few times again in Isaiah already, that he is first and he is last, Alpha and Omega, beginning and the end. And I am he is here again, in contrast to the Babylonian virgin from chapter 47 who was trying to declare that title for herself. In verse 13, what has God done? God has created. And you can compare this to chapter 47, specifically verse 13, to the astrologers of Babylon who thought that they could basically divide the heavens. They could make the judgment on use the stars to tell the future and whatnot. Here, God is contrasting himself. He's the one that created those things. He created all of that. Verse 14 gives us a picture of court again, not uncommon in Isaiah's book. The Yahweh loves him in verse 14. Who is this him? Well, the context helps to unpack that a little bit. He shall perform his purpose on Babylon. So who's the one that's going to do that? That would be Cyrus. So the Yahweh loves Cyrus, the one he has chosen to redeem Judah from Babylon. God has, verse 15, spoken and called him. God has called Cyrus, even by name, to be the one who will deliver his people, just as he did with Moses at the beginning of the book of Exodus. And in verse 16, Yahweh has sent me and his spirit. Be interesting to try and figure out, and the context doesn't help us as much as this one. Who is the me in verse 16? Could be Isaiah, that God has sent Isaiah to speak this prophecy to the people. It could be Cyrus, that God has sent Cyrus to Babylon to do this thing. It could be Jesus, in which case suddenly this becomes a Trinitarian verse, as Jesus is the one who ultimately delivers us from sin, death, and the devil, and Cyrus is just a foreshadowing of a greater thing in Jesus. Cyrus is the Persian name, the Persian word that means king. Jesus is the greatest king, the better king. Verse 18, had we paid attention to the commandments, had we actually lived the commandments promised a long life. Had Adam and Eve never sinned in the garden, they never would have died. God is longing for this. He's longing for life. He is longing for his creation to be restored. Peace like a river. It reminds me of the hymn, When Peace Like a River. It's number 763 in our Lutheran hymnal, the Lutheran service book. These phrases point to the idea of numerous, abundant, that God would have so richly cared for his people. And in verse 19, their name would not have been cut off. It's a family conversation there. Has our name been cut off from before God because of our sin and our rebellion? And the answer to that is no. Your name today as a Christian is written in the book of life, not because of what you've done, but because of what Christ has done for you. Verse 20, God calls his people out of Babylon, and Cyrus indeed is going to be the one who performs that good deed and sets them free. Now God tells them to shout, to proclaim it, to say to the earth that Yahweh has redeemed his servant. That's another good family question. Who can you tell this? You have the same thing to say, with a shout of joy, with proclamation, to say to whoever you can, Yahweh has redeemed his servant, referring to yourself. Yahweh has redeemed you. God has redeemed you. Jesus has saved you by his death and by his resurrection. Who can you tell that good news to? Who do you know that needs to hear it? And there are so many people that we could talk about in our families as we think that through. And then it would be good to pray for them. Pray to the Lord for opportunities to share that good news. Verse 21 points to the idea that God always provides. He cared for his people throughout their time in the wilderness. He continues to care for us through our time here in this place. And then lastly, the text today ending with the idea that God says there is no peace for the wicked, a reference to condemnation for those who do not believe.